Chapter 1. Myth, Literature, and the African Child. Origins of an Impossible Vocation. I think one of the strongest shaping urges of my life has been a search for knowledge. I experience ignorance as a painful tension that eases into relief and pleasure as I find the information I need. The ignorance that caused me the most intense pain as a child was at once personal and social. I wanted to know who I was, who my people were, what the world was like, and in what ways were we connected to each other. The search for answers took me from home to school, on journeys during which my initial queries coalesced into a practical question. Now that I have a working idea of who I am, the society that produced me, and the world I will be growing into, how best can I be myself in that society and that world? In other words, what is the best work I can do? For persons satisfactorily adjusted to the world as they find it, this question entails little anguish. Society invites them to occupy choice places. Then their adult lives can unfold more or less smoothly as they locate their desired working and living spaces, move into them, and once there, construct their personal and family lives as integrated parts of a wider world. For me, this choice involved a conundrum. By the time I was ready to choose a life path, my formal education, fruit of my mother's determination that I would attend the best schools, abetted by extraordinary luck, the affection of teachers, and the friendship of great souls, had given me the profile of a young man likely to do rather well within the status quo. There was a catch, however. On the way to the compilation of their resume, I had acquired a habit of inquiring into the present organization of the world and how things came to be the way they are. In the course of that inquiry, I found that the status quo so utterly repulsive that the very idea of success, that is to say, of finding a comfortable, rewarding, working, and living space within the present world system, seemed absurd. What I aspired to instead was to seek out others who had likewise examined the world, found its organization unjust, and were pooling their energies, working to change it for the better. I did not want to integrate into the world I was born into. I wanted to help change it. I should state here that at no point did I think the changed society I dreamed of could be brought about through writing. When I examine the writer's profession from a social perspective, I see it as a métier with built-in conservative tendencies. Search into the social circumstances of African precursors in the craft, traditional spokespersons in feudal times, scribes in ancient Kemet, has confirmed this impression. Griots and scribes worked within and for the status quo of their times. How then could one walk along their intellectual pathways as a writer, and yet manage to spend one's working life not serving an established world order steeped to its gills in injustice? In the energy of youth, I saw the combination of the writer's vocation with life of a social revolutionary in Africa as impossible. To this day, I consider writing a retreat from the initiatory edge of social change. If I have made writing the focus of my adult energies, it is not because I consider it in any fundamental sense a revolutionary activity. It is because in my initial push to find work with like-minded bringers of social change, revolutionaries, I failed. Having failed to work for revolutionary change, I wanted to find a profession least likely to turn me into an auxiliary of the established world order. For reasons both personal, and writing is certainly hard work, but for me it is also a kind of highly enjoyable play. And social, in today's world, it is impossible for writers to earn a decent living from book sales instead of depending on establishment patronage. if they can avoid the embrace of hyenas masquerading as publishers. The profession I chose was writing. Occasionally, certain curious persons who, not knowing me, are tempted to surmise my character from my academic curriculum vitae have found it puzzling that I could have ever conceived of grounding my grounding in elite educational institutions at Yamota, Groton, Harvard, Columbia, as preparation for anything but a prestigious position in the established world, just the way it happens to be. Such puzzlement is due to a failure to understand that before entering the world of schools, I grew up in a home environment that gave me a point of view from which I could see that the vision of reality the established world offered me in its magnificent schools was an atrocious lie. If such a conclusion sounds unkind, consider this aspect of my background. Before I went to school, I lived in Cape Coast, a West African town where the largest artificial structure was a castle built in the enslaving era by European raiders who went on from Elmina and Cape Coast to build other bases for their missions of global massacre elsewhere in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the Americas. As a child, I could walk away from my home, go to the beach, and continue all the way to the castle. Older people talked occasionally of the way that structure had been used to hold Africans captured to go to work unpaid in order to enrich Europeans. That descendants of the Europeans who had organized the massive atrocities still ruled the world I was born into was clear even as a child. They administered Africa as a series of occupied territories, relying on help from Africans able to accept the world the enslavers made as a reasonable world and eager to integrate into it for pay. Next, consider this. Around the time when I was preparing to enter secondary school, I saw a slender, handsome young African marched into a courtroom like a criminal. He was, in fact, the opposite of a criminal. But all Africa was at the same time divided into colonies, territories owned by European states, and from which European corporations took out whatever resources they wanted for their own prosperity, leaving practically all Africans in the deliberate poverty and neglect now euphemistically called underdevelopment. The man in handcuffs had left Gold Coast in his youth to study in America. He had come back saying it was time Africans ruled Africa, and he used African resources not to enrich European corporations and African stooges, but to create prosperity and meaningful work for Africans in Africa. Such has been the nature of the European connection with Africa these many centuries that European rulers considered him a dangerous criminal. Tried like a criminal, he was sentenced and jailed under a pseudo-legal system that defined a demand for democratic rights coming from an African as a crime. That attractive young man I saw when I was 11 was called Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah. And finally, consider this. Having fulfilled my mother's wishes, gone to Achimota like my father, and then gone to Groton and Harvard in America, I was one of a generation of young Africans who witnessed, at long range but nonetheless with great intensity, the rise of another attractive African who wanted democracy in African society. In place of European oppression, neglect, and poverty. Lumumba's charisma was based on a message of great intelligence and beautiful honesty. Europeans, he said, had ruled the Congo for centuries, drained off enormous riches, yet brought no creative changes. It was time Africans ruled Africa democratically and used African resources to create schools for the young, hospitals for the sick, prosperity for all. And like the Nkrumah I saw on his way to jail, Lumumba was considered dangerous by Europeans for these ideas. For attempting to implement them, he was assassinated. The murder was done by African thugs funded, trained, organized, supported, and guided by Europeans and Americans who did not hesitate to use the United Nations for their purposes. In place of Lumumba, they wanted African resources used to create jobs, prosperity, and amenities for Africans. The Europeans and Americans installed Mobutu, the kind of manufactured African ruler who did not mind the pillage of the continent as long as he, his family, and his tribe got enriched on the imperial leavings fed him as a prebendal aid and loans. These and many similar considerations serve to bring me to the conclusion that the world order we live in under today is deeply criminal. As for myself, I tried to find a way of working to enhance the ideas of Nkrumah and Lumumba, but failed. Even so, I was determined to live as far from the pattern of soulless Mobutu as possible. If I could do this as a writer, so much the better. Had I been drawn to the literature in my school days, but extraordinary explanatory promise of narrative. But the way we were taught literature turned out to be peculiarly unbalanced. While we were given abundant space to assimilate information about the glories of English literature and European culture, we had little opportunity to consider the functioning of the world we would grow into and live and work in. As an undergraduate, I decided to correct this imbalance. In search of greater understanding, I switched from literature to social studies. The switch so changed my perception of myself and my conception of the world I would like to work in, that I left the university in an attempt to connect with revolutionaries working to change Africa. I did not regret my move away from literature. I certainly did not see it as a betrayal. Quite the contrary. I consider the urge to help change an unjust world entirely creative. As creative as any work of art can be. I reverted to writing not because I changed my mind about the desirability of revolution in this world of injustice, but because in the attempt to act upon my aspirations, I failed. The failure of my youthful dream of an attractive revolutionary life left me initially ill, then permanently bereft of the energy and drive. Out of such despair, recovery can only be relative. When I felt ready to plan what I could do with the little energy I had left, I reverted to writing as the occupation least likely to involve me in the destructive assaults against humanity and Africa that constitute the routine business of the status quo. Let me speak plainly. I see the existing system of the world government, with its concatenation of debt peonage and structural adjustment programs, as a continuation of the same mercantile soullessness that brought us slavery as an economic system, then colonialism and its other descendants. Had I been able to work against it, I would have. Having failed, I write because writing is the least harmful way that I have found to spend my time. Having chosen a professional path, I knew it was up to me to acquire the training that would enable me to function creditably in the writer's trade. For literature, like all art and science, grows out of the nurture of a tradition. From which tradition would I work? I set out to find out what I could about my antecedents, those who before me had chosen the same vocational path. I did so because I wanted to approach the work the way all serious professionals approach their craft. I wanted to learn from those gone before the nature of the work and the best, most honorable ways to do it. This book is in part a report on that search. It is not an autobiography, a narrative of my life. Neither is it an academic dissertation, a study of a comprehensive series of literary texts. It is a report on the growth to consciousness of an African mind to the reality of African literature, its origins, its antecedents, and the creative future it could have. It is an account on the personal level of the dawning, early growth, abandonment, then retrieval of a vocation, that of a writer. Bibliographically, this book directs attention toward a list that may at first sight appear unduly selective. A bit of reflection will lead to the conclusion that the distillation is appropriate. My aim here is to focus on a number of texts analyzed together, enable us to see African literature as an evolving body of interconnected works covering the entire recorded history of this continent, from the beginnings of writing in ancient Egypt to the latest publications of today. Beyond past roots and present flowering, I also intend to suggest future approaches. In the process, I propose to describe in specific terms an ancient African concept with great educational promise for the future, the concept of per ankh, as we shall see in chapter 21. Blessings of an unhappy childhood. A familiar cliche has it that a good preparation for a writer's vocation is an unhappy childhood. I would add a modifying condition, that the child thus blessed with unhappiness being able to discover early the power of reading and listening as openings into immense possibilities of intellectual fulfillment and emotional happiness. I cannot in any case claim to have had an exceptionally unhappy childhood. Colonial Africa was a locus of pervasive misery, so that wherever I lived, I saw large numbers of children whose situation was worse than mine. I did discover reading and conversation very early, though. The reason had a great deal to do with the details of my early life, my early family life. My mother and father met when they were quite young. They came from different ethnic backgrounds. My mother's group, Akan, was matrilineal. My father's, Iwe, was patrilineal. They were both teachers, brought together by study and work. Of their relationship, I never heard a word from my father. In his patriarchal culture, grown-up men did not converse with children about such matters, or indeed about anything else. From conversations with my mother, I gathered that they fell in love, got married, settled down, and raised children, both continuing to teach. My mother's family had no objection to the young couple's choice, but my father's thought he should have married within his own ethnic group. They also thought he had no right to choose his own wife, marriage being a union of families, not individuals. They sent him another wife. My mother expected my father to resist the imposition. He did not. Looking with hindsight at the circumstances of his life, I see why he could not. His family, clan, and tribe were astoundingly supportive of members at all times, so no matter how far we traveled, there was always a home ready to receive us for as long as we needed to stay. But the penalty for disobedience was ostracism, a prospect which would surely have broken my father's spirit. Unfortunately, the alternative, life without my mother, just as surely broke him. My mother was not made for a polygamous household. My parents divorced before I was old enough to start school. For about 2 years, I was considered too little to go to my father. I accompanied my mother to the school where she taught. She trained me to sit quietly beside a friend among the pupils, and in their free time, other pupils entertained by me reading stories from their books to me. At 5, I was separated from my mother and sent to live with my father in Asakangwa, a tiny rural town where he had been sent to teach. The trip took several days. I first refused to let go of my mother, but the adults pried me loose with fantastic promises. During the first days of separation, I believed my mother would come up the road at any moment. For weeks I waited for her. By the time I understood she would not be coming, I had entered the first year of formal schooling, almost by accident. Rural schools in Asakangwa and we also, where my father went to teach, had pretty new buildings with glass windows. The school compounds, like the towns themselves, were surrounded by forests and streams. Every child entering the school system at the time was expected to be sufficiently grown to reach his or her right hand overhand and to touch the left ear. At that age, I was too small to pass the test, but since my father was a teacher and I was able to sit quietly for hours on end, I was allowed to sit in class 1 anyway. The idea was that in a year or two, I would grow big enough to begin real schooling. In the spirit of a joke, the teacher let me do class exercises along with the older children. He was startled after the first test to discover that I could read, write, and do arithmetic. At the end of the first year, I was not simply allowed to enter the normal school stream, but actually made to skip class 2 to go directly into class 3. The teachers had concluded I had already knew what was there to learn in the second year. The class 3 teacher, Mr. Mensah, was a delight. He was a store of wonderful stories, and his method was to promise to tell us a new one if we finished our classwork ahead of time and got all our answers right. If I do not remember the years spent with my father as unrelievably happy, the reason has to be Teacher Mensah, the storyteller. I also met a group of friendly older pupils who told me stories from their homes and asked me to tell them about life in Cape Coast, the city where I had come from. Separated from a mother I adored, underfed, and neglected by a stepmother focused on her own younger children, puzzled by a father whose only mode of contact with children was through collective punishment for misbehavior of any individual, I lived in a small world of friends who told stories about a huge world outside, and quite unexpectedly admired and loved me for my ability to read and write and calculate, especially since I was the littlest person around. Under certain circumstances, it was logical that reading and stories became a central part of my life. With several of the stories Teacher Mensah told us, I was already familiar from evening sessions with my maternal grandmother and other relatives. Most were amusing animal fables, but Teacher Mensah knew a vast range of other stories, some about historical events, such as the founding of the Asante Nation, and some apparently from as far away as India and China. There was a long cycle of stories about Ose Tutu, his love affair with the daughter of the king of Dechira, his friendship with his teacher and mentor, the priest Anoche, which I found particularly intriguing. Something about the way they began made me wish I could hear more. I wanted to know where the Asante themselves had come from. At home in Cape Coast, especially during festivals, naming ceremonies, weddings, and above all, funeral rituals, I had heard adults tell stories or sometimes sing songs about long and difficult journeys across vast spaces, far, far back in our people's past. The Asante narratives Teacher Mensah told us often started the same way. I used to come away from funeral ceremonies, some of which lasted days on end, with a powerful impression that has been repeatedly reinforced in later years, as I observed the same characteristic rituals in other parts of Africa. The impression was that these rituals were a sort of continuous reunion of a very large family, one capable of expanding to embrace everyone within reach. I remember, in particular, the songs and chants made up of names, as names of ancestors long gone kept coming back to be given to new babies. At times, there were participants whose faith in the return of the ancestors was so strong that they actually looked for physical signs showing that the baby was indeed a particular ancestor come back. Less fancifully, though, old names were kept alive through reuse, and the process strengthened an abiding cultural idea that death was a transition, that through it family members went away, but that through birth, another transition, they returned in spirit. Some of the weeping articulated a constant anxiety about the difficulty of the transition. The dead needed help on their way. Spirits of the dead, if denied the wherewithal for a proper crossing into the groves of the ancestors, were said to turn into wandering ghosts, restless and destructive, until their families and friends restored the missing items in ceremonies of atonement. During the funerals I saw at home, they were given this help in the form of money, preferably gold dust, the fare for crossing a river. Favorite objects were placed beside the deceased traveler, and on the grave there was always food and drink for souls. It mattered little if vagrants ate the food and drank the drinks at night. Wandering spirits might inhabit anyone or anything. Mostly, the ancestral spirits were supposed to come back repeatedly to their favorite haunts: a tree, a hill, a pond, a river, a grove. We were told ordinary persons could not see them, but their visits were strong reasons for protecting these places, and since certain animals and plants were also homes for familiar spirits, we were expected to respect them too. So we knew there were selected animals and plants we were not, under any circumstances, to turn into food. They were not just energy to be used. Souls lived in them. The presence of kin souls everywhere made for a sense of connection across space and time. The great fear was that the destruction of continuity between the living, the dead, and the yet unborn would open the way to avalanches of destruction. The dead would be in danger, having received too little help or none at all in the passage into a new part of the universe that should have been rendered familiar and welcoming to them through sacrifices and offerings from living kin. They would grow alienated, lose vital energy, and become too weak or embittered to send their blessings from the spirit world to the world they left behind. Their suffering would be passed on 1,000-fold to the surviving relatives and friends whose negligence had brought it on in the first place. Such a vision of connections between the living and the dead and the unborn, and all three branches of the human chain meant that every family, in principle, was supposed to pay particular attention to the maintenance of vital links between its living members and those gone ahead, as well as those to come. Families, therefore, gave ancestors a special place, and because family lines determined legitimacy, the veneration of ancestors was most intense in families directly attached to ruling lineages. In my family, the person who represented this reality most clearly was my maternal grandmother. I think it was perfectly normal for me to see her as my favorite person. From my perspective as a little boy, she seemed to be a tall, erect, quiet, and serene person. I have a hard time remembering her shouting, even raising her voice, or actually quarreling. Occasionally, though, she and her younger sister, who lived next door, might be heard singing traditional and sacred songs, using the lyrics to launch bitter accusations against the other. There were brief, whispered stories of my grandmother having enjoyed a life as rich as a rich young wife in the days when my grandfather, the old gold dealer Inse of Nukroflu in Bibiani, was alive. But she herself did everything she could to impress on us that such stories were distant futilities. She was unfailingly frugal, her economical habits a cause of constant and sometimes overt teasing by my sisters and aunt and cousins. I'm sorry now to say I was a thoughtless participant in this disrespectful behavior. Unassuming though her ways were, my grandmother seemed to have a rather mysterious importance. Visitors came to see her from place that for many years I only knew of as our villages. I was a curious child, and adults tended to be indulgent with me, answering my questions even when they thought them impertinent. But my grandmother's answers were always too brief when we talked when the talk turned to our villages. Why were they ours? We came from there. Those villages were our real homes, since no one could really be said to come from Cape Coast, a recent town. Further questioning brought a firm put down. These were adult matters, impanisim, and not to be discussed with children. Some of the information my grandmother was so silent about, I was able to piece together from evening storytelling sessions. Mostly these began with riddles, conundrums, word and memory games, animal fables, especially the cycle of stories about the anti-hero Anansi, prototype of the human being as pure, selfish ego. These were enjoyable, but talk sessions during hunters and fishers festivals, funerals, marriages, or naming ceremonies sometimes yielded accounts that carried a more exciting charge. Generally, this was because they brought me information previously missing from my understanding of our family's history. The story I elicited from pestering my mother's aunts, uncles, family friends, and visitors from the mysterious ancestral villages went like this. Centuries ago, we lived in a place far from our present home. Life was so good we grew sleepy, and in our drowsiness we were overtaken by the arrival of a strange new religion, Islam. The Muslims wanted us to drop our ancestral ways and to adopt the ways of their ancestors. We refused, but some of our people were converted or succumbed to force. Those who wanted to preserve the ways of our ancestors, having fought and lost, migrated. Over decades and centuries, we the Akan arrived in the West African grasslands, then the forest of Asante and Brong Ahafo, where those of us who felt at peace in the forest settled. Some moved all the way till we came to the coast. On these last journeys, our main leaders were a woman Eku and 3 men, Oson, Oborum Akoma, and Odapa Dijan. Mankesim, the capital city, was where we settled. From there, various leaders set out with smaller groups to found and settle the villages that now make up the Federation of the Fanse people. Since then, the families of those original founders have been the families from which traditional rulers have been chosen. My mother's family was descended, matrilineally, from the founders of 3 villages in the Fanse rural hinterland near Cape Coast. Since the Akan Queen Mothers determined the choice of rulers, my elder brother Ai and I were expected, when our ruling uncles died, to succeed them as heads of the 3 villages. Ordinary Akan stories are known as Anansesim, after the spider, who figures in many of them as the folk anti-hero. Family histories are esoteric, distinguished from ordinary exoteric stories by a different name. They are called Abakosem. A working paraphrase would be narratives of times past, literally Abba. It has happened. Ko. It is gone. Asim. Matter or narrative. It is still a matter of some surprise to me that no research group in the literature departments of the universities of Legon, Kumasi, Cape Coast, or Abidjan has undertaken to collect, analyze, and translate the whole cycle of Akan epic traditions. A version of the Akan Chronicle was published by the Reverend Gadiel Akwa, a Fanse convert to the European religion, Christianity, in 1939. The following is an excerpt from Akwa's rendering of the narrative of Akan migration from ancient Ghana to present-day Ghana. The Akan text. See, I'm not even going to try that. The English translation. Ancient esoteric tradition assures us that long ago the people of Ghana had a home in North Africa, in far-off Sudan, site of a very great black nation. It was because they rejected Islam that the Fanse ancestors broke with the other people of Ghana. They then pulled up roots, traveling by stages, waging hard battles until they reached this place. Some traveled east, reaching Benin. They came by sea, all the way to this Ghana. It is some of their descendants who speak Adangbe, Gai, and Iwe. Others traveled west and came to Techimai. These migrants were the Akan ancestors, the Fanse, the Asante, the Akin, the Awasa, the Asin, the Kwahu, the Akuapem, Agona, Nijida, and Akwamu. They all speak one language, 10 dialects. The family Abakosim, I heard as a child, elaborated on this narrative. According to it, when migrating Akan came south from Techimai, they settled in the Asante and Burong, Ahafo forest region. Subsequently, smaller groups pushed farther south toward the Atlantic coast. The first major town they founded was Makisim, literally the great city. And to this day, this modest town is regarded as the spiritual capital of the Fanse people. In the normal course of history, as the migrant population grew, smaller groups spread out in the neighboring countryside, founding villages. The families of the founders of these villages came in time to be recognized as traditional rulers. Akan customary law being matrilineal, hereditary rule passes through the women of these families. In her time, my grandmother was the elder woman of the family descended from the founders of 3 Fanse villages my relatives called our villages, Abowonu, Esaman, Eta Kurasi. As queen mother for all 3 villages, my grandmother would provide sons to rule the villages. After them, succession would pass through her eldest daughter, my mother. My mother wanted 3 sons in addition to her 2 daughters, but she had 2 boys. She kept hoping and trying until very late in life to have that 3rd son, to head the 3rd ancestral village, but he never came. I was her 3rd child and 2nd son. Though to our relatives in the village, my grandmother, and after her my mother, remained the queen mother, they came regularly to see them. We the children were not taken there. I did not get to see the ancestral villages until the year I left Ghana to continue my formal education at Groton and Harvard in the USA. Shortly before my flight out of Accra, I asked my mother to accompany me on a visit, and I was finally able to see the ancestral place, a vast land of friendly people, forests, and streams. It was a sore point with my mother that I refused to take seriously the idea of my family being so-called natural rulers. Discussions with her on the subject were uneasy and unfrequent. Once or twice she cut them short in anger. The trouble was that, though I was quiet, I would be a rather articulate, undiplomatic child. Our family's claim to authority was founded not on warfare, but on the fact that our ancestors had led migrations, founded settlements, and stayed committed to the cultural values our people considered vital. I made it clear that while I thought all this a splendid achievement, for them I considered the notion that their social status would be passed down to us, their physical descendants, though not through any achievement of our own, but simply because we were of the blood, a case of social fraud. In the beginning, my mother laughed off my arguments as exhibitions of childish foolishness. She firmly expected me to grow out of such silly egalitarian ideas. When, in my early adult years, she understood that I was not about to change my thinking about status, the notion of natural rulers, hereditary power, and social privilege, her disappointment turned to fury. I doubt whether I can really say I survived the impact of a proud mother's expectant love turned to rage. Despite my negative attitude to matters of social privilege, in at least one respect, I know I owe my mother and grandmother a debt of infinite gratitude. By the accident of being their child and grandchild, I grew up knowing I possessed a physical and spiritual connection to human beings who lived centuries and millennia ago. From infancy, I heard their narrative, often in brief snatches, sometimes in longer episodes. There was in no doubt whatsoever that it was mine. Whenever I heard the names Oberum Ankoma, Odapo Dijan, and Oson, I could travel back in my imagination down those centuries. The narrative said, my relatives in those long-gone days founded cities and villages, worried about ways to protect customs they valued, coped with tremendous stress in difficult times, and created new places and ways of living. It is difficult to persuade African children growing up with such a background of family history that they come from a people without history. Thinking back, it occurs to me that under logical circumstances, my growth would have taken me into a school system in which my initial fascination with narrative forms like the Abakosim and Anansim brought from home might have deepened into increasingly systematic, specialized studies in fiction, drama, and poetry. On the one hand, equivalent to Anansim, and on the other hand, history, philosophy, sociology, the equivalent of Bakosim. The educational progression this would have entailed would have been entirely natural. When I got to secondary school, however, I entered a learning world in which practically everything I did in the classroom was planned to pull my mind steadily away from the narratives and realities I knew from home toward a different kind of narrative, made in Europe.